Hey everyone, welcome to the 21st Century SGS Podcast, where we dive deep into crossroads of sustainability and digital transformation, revealing how AI and emerging tech can drive real impact into the fighting against climate change. Dr. Ravi, good to have you back once again. And in the last three episodes, we spoke in terms of climate emergencies. We spoke about um, is there is a climate emergency, and then we also spoke about 21st century leadership, science led, and we also spoke about on our third episode the 21st board leadership model. In this, I remember you very well emphasized a key subject, which is the six modules that you emphasized in terms of fighting climate change. In that, I believe there is much more to discuss, and we are quite enthusiastic to see what these climate emergencies are. So, out of the six topics, we're going to talk about the first climate emergency. What is climate emergency is? So, over to you, Doctor.
Thank you. Uh, Very excited about our first module, which is what is the climate emergency? The climate emergency in the world, the, the timing in terms of when scientists have assessed when the climate emergency started was 1880. Why 1880? Because 1880 is when we had the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the nation started discovering coal as a potential way of powering and powering machines and powering locomotives. And that was the first time that we started burning coal in a significant manner. So when we talk of the climate emergency, we are talking of an industrial revolution which started in 1880, and we are now looking at 2024 and almost 36 to 37 years since the beginning of the industrial revolution. And what has happened in that period is that by burning fossil fuels, which is four key categories of three categories of fossil fuels. One is coal, number two is oil and petroleum and diesel, and number three is natural gas. By burning these three fossil fuels in abundance to basically power the world in terms of electricity, energy, and logistical movement, we have basically filled the planet with greenhouse gases. And when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions, we are talking about the greenhouse gas emissions each of these three fossil fuels put out into the atmosphere. So every time we uh, burn coal, and to generate 1 gigawatt of annual electricity from coal, believe it or not, 820 tons of carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere. If we use oil, and here we're talking of petroleum and diesel, 720 tons of greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere. Every time we use natural gas, 490 tons of greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide are released into the atmosphere just to generate 1 gigawatt hour of annual electricity. So basically, between 1880 and 2024, the amount of coal, oil, and natural gas that has been burnt in the atmosphere has led to a massive amount of carbon emissions being released into the global atmosphere. Now, you might ask the question, so which countries have contributed to this massive amount of carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere, and what is the mix in terms of greenhouse gases that are contributing to the climate emergency. So the first answer to that question is that in terms of global greenhouse gases, 26% of these greenhouse gases are coming from the use of fossil fuels in generating power. 11% comes from industry. 15% comes from transport. 6% comes from buildings. 10% from simply producing fuel. 9% from industrial processes, 11% from agriculture, 7% from land use, and 4% from waste and other factors. So, global greenhouse gases as at 2023 December was 57 gigatons of greenhouse gases have been released into the atmosphere. That is just in 1 year. And basically, what has been happening over the period is that carbon emissions have now basically trapped are trapped in the atmosphere, and as a result of trapping carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, global temperatures have now risen to an all-time high between 1880, which is called the Industrial Revolution's commencement, and 2024 March. We have now seen a massive spike in global temperatures, and believe it or not, in March 2024, we recorded a plus 1.56 degrees temperature on top of the average temperatures. And this is basically now going, this year, 2024, is now going to be recorded as the warmest, hottest year recorded in the history of the planet, with a plus 1.54 degrees centigrade temperature rise. And in terms of carbon emissions, 92% of year-to-date cumulative emissions have been emitted by the global north. And when I talk of the global north, we are talking of the USA and the European Union and Australia. These are the three nations that have contributed 92% of cumulative emissions. And when one looks at emissions in isolation in a year, the picture is different, because now we can see that China has begun to be a key emitter. But in terms of year-to-date emissions from 1880, the real culprits are the USA and the European Union. So if one looks at a snapshot of 2023 and carbon emissions, about 12 million tons of 12,604 tons of carbon dioxide has been emitted by China, and USA is number 2 with 5,130, and your total Europe is third with 3,776 tons of greenhouse gases. So that is the current picture, but we have to bear in mind the cumulative picture. So when greenhouse gases keep getting accumulated and trapping the global heat in its atmosphere, then we have global warming. And global warming now has crossed a very, very pivotal point, which is the plus 1.5 degrees centigrade. And if you remember, Deshana, when the Paris Agreement was signed in December 2015 in Paris, and 190 countries signed to reduce greenhouse gases, the whole target was to make sure we don't cross the plus 1.5 degrees centigrade. But we have crossed it now. And as a result of crossing it, we now have a crisis in our hands because the kind of damage to the global economy is now basically going into a tailspin due to this issue. So, what is the kind of impact global warming and crossing 1.5 degrees centigrade will have on the global economy? So, let me give you a snapshot of what that could be if, as per the World Economic Forum and as per Swiss Re, which are one of the big reinsurance agents. According to the most recent figures that have come up from the World Economic Forum, now that we have crossed plus 1.5 degrees centigrade, the estimated global GDP impact is 4% of GDP, and the global GDP is about $105 trillion. If we cross plus 2 degrees centigrade, that figure goes up to 11% of GDP. If we cross 3% of 3 degrees centigrade, the figure increases to 18% of GDP. And if we cross 4 degrees centigrade, the figure can go up to 30% of global GDP. So we have now just crossed the first barrier, which is 1.5 degrees centigrade. And this is actually a massive warning, because basically what has happened over the period of time from 1880 is from about 21 gigatons of greenhouse gases or 40 tons of greenhouse gases and 21 tons of carbon dioxide, this figure has now increased to 56 tons of greenhouse gases. The carbon concentration in the atmosphere has increased from 280 parts per million to 420 parts per million. And global temperatures have gone up from a plus 1.2 degrees centigrade. Now we have crossed 1.56 degrees centigrade. So, in a nutshell, Deshana, this is called the climate emergency. The climate emergency is we have crossed these unprecedented temperature gains, and that in turn is setting off a whole series of extreme weather incidents, which are the reason why we are going to see the impacts on the global GDP. So you must be familiar, Deshana, with the term uh, the World Economic Forum, which meets every year in Davos. And when they met in February this year in Davos, they listed extreme weather incidents as the number one risk that the world is facing today. And the kind of damage I have already shown you in through extreme weather incidents as temperatures go up from 1.5 degrees to 4 degrees centigrade. So it becomes almost a urgent priority now for nations and businesses to measure their carbon footprint and to reduce their carbon footprint with urgency, so that less carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases are in the atmosphere, if we want to make sure we don't get to 2 degrees centigrade in a very, very short period of time. So what is this carbon footprint? The first item on in terms of everybody understanding is a nation and a company and a business and an individual has a carbon footprint. So what is this carbon footprint? The carbon footprint is the measure of the amount of fossil fuels each of us consume that releases carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, which were induced by the nation as a total, by a company, or by a household over a period of time. And these carbon emissions are broken into two categories. One is direct emissions, which are called scope 1 emissions, and indirect emissions, which are called Scope 2 and 3 emissions. So, the key point I want to make today in terms of the climate emergency is that extreme weather incidents have basically tripled in the last couple of years since 2020. Heat waves have increased 7.5 times. Droughts have increased 3.6 times. Crop failures have increased 3 times. River floods by almost 2.8 times. And wildfires by almost twice. And all of this is going to have a direct impact on global GDPs. So reducing carbon emissions becomes no longer an option, but it is now the priority for every nation. And the question really is, do we have global leaders in nations who are ready to do that? In fact, Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, in a recent speech says the problem is not supplying simply fossil fuel emissions, it's fossil fuels, period. So the, the climate emergency is as a result of burning fossil fuels. And there is a report that comes out every year called Banking on Climate Chaos, which looks at the banking sector and how they are funding fossil fuel expansion. And this is a stark finding from that report. It says in the 6 years since the adoption of the Paris Agreement in 2015, the world's 60 largest private sector banks finance fossil fuels to the tune of US dollars 4.6 trillion. So that is a summary of what the climate emergency is. And it is also a summary of how we have now crossed a critical point, which is the plus 1.5 degrees centigrade. And the impetus and the urgency is for businesses, nations, and individuals to urgently reduce their carbon footprint.
Thank you, Doctor. This is a set of overwhelming numbers that you shared. And it's also the way I see the spillover effects of these events, how it's going to affect not just countries, but businesses and individuals. As a result, everybody, whether they're directly or indirectly connected, will have an impact. The biggest challenge that I was trying to overcome and try to understand that in order to replicate an alternative resource for energy production, if I may say,
Correct.
all the options which is available in terms of renewable energy um, is not still giving the sufficient outcomes. That means the production level. Say if you take, for an example, hydrogen, which is something everybody is considering and looking at, blue hydrogen, green hydrogen. I'm not going to talk a lot about those subjects, but the biggest challenge it has is its storage and transportation, which is going to take much more space. Also, it's going to take much more. So, for example, if you wanted to transport hydrogen, you have to store it at a very low temperature, which is going up to minus 70 Celsius, which is some countries may not be able to do that because it's a huge infrastructure investment and it's an economically they are not capable or viable for them, and there is no capital available. But you spoke something very interesting, that subsidies which is given by governments over other alternatives which is in the market, predominantly fossil based energy production. If they can push that into other sources, it would be quite quite efficient, and the capital can be efficient. But I also, in a positivity, or based on what you just spoke, the positivity that I see is that some of these larger corporations are now slowly transforming some of their capital into, now if you take Netherlands for an example, 80% of renewable energy initiations are being funded by oil and gas companies, so which is a very good sign. um, and also some countries around the world are really getting that benefit in terms of their infrastructure, and also the technology transformation. So one of the things that I'm trying to achieve and educate people who are engaging with with us in terms of our technology, we are always trying to say is that let's start small, let's make improvements in terms of what you do currently, take small steps, and then it can lead into much more larger outcomes, improving as a business how we can improve our efficiency. As a result, they will reduce the energy consumption. And how can we reduce the energy consumption by replacing alternative technologies,
Correct.
simple things, and improve 1%, half a percent, 2% in every touch point of their business, so that all cumulatively can reduce
Carbon emission.
energy carbon emission, and that means energy usage. So if you reduce your processes by, say, if an organization, if they're reducing their processes by 6 to 7 um, seconds of each transaction, it has a direct
Impact.
8%
Oh,
impact
yeah.
on your bottom line.
Correct.
So these are the things sometimes people ignore, because they say small percentages people ignore, but large percentages people try to look at and see what is this all about. But it's accumulation of it all adds up, and then it
Absolutely.
becomes a bigger outcome.
Correct.
Considering all of that, with the limited time that we have, if you can quickly wrap up with us, what is the government's need to do in terms of urgency, if you really look at under climate emergencies, and then also what would be the
Business.
what businesses needs to do urgently, and also what family or individual needs to do urgent. If you can just give us some good tips on those three areas, that'd be great, doctor.
Excellent. So, when I started today, I talked about the impact of coal, oil, and petroleum and natural gas, and that every gigaton of electricity or energy developed through those resources, contribute to between 820 tons and 490 tons of greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide. Now, let me give the alternative. So, the four alternatives we have with us in terms of renewable energy sources, I think the most prevalent and used renewable energy source in the world is hydropower. And compared to the figures I've given you all up to now, hydropower, for every gigawatt of energy or heat, for every gigawatt hour of annual electricity production consumption, only releases 34 gigatons per hour. Nuclear energy is 3 tons. Wind is 4 tons, and solar power is only 5 tons. Just imagine the spectrum is between 3 tons and 34 tons versus 490 tons and 820 tons. So the first thing is, the good news for us is that these new renewable energy sources are now very, very advanced and well developed. And the price of solar panels and battery storage has declined almost 65% in the last 10 years. And these are now available for deployment in the world. But to make these deployments happen, then governments and business leaders have to have a very clear understanding of the term sustainability. And sustainability is a term coined by the British economist John Elkington. And what he basically said was, for there to be sustainability, a nation or a business must have an economic growth model which does not harm the environment and which directly contributes to social progress. Now, we need leaders with that mindset. So, our country is progressing in terms of moving towards renewable energy sources. So, here's the good news: the following countries have already achieved 100% of energy transition, and they are now considered the leaders. And the predominant energy source these countries are using is hydroelectricity. The five countries which have already achieved 100% renewable energy in terms of their energy mix is Albania, Bhutan, Ethiopia, Nepal, and Paraguay. And the other very interesting figure that I want to share with you as a country is China. China's target for achievement by the year 2030 that they committed to in the Paris Agreement was to develop 1,200 gigawatts of renewable energy sources to their mix. Believe it or not, they achieved that number this year, 4 years ahead of the Paris Agreement commitment. And we have also seen an amazing turnaround by a company in Denmark called Ørsted, who in 1972 was founded to be the fossil fuel company of Denmark, but they had a turnaround, and by 2007, they commenced a journey to become a renewable energy company, giving up fossil fuels altogether. And today, Ørsted is the world leader in offshore wind, and it's the fifth largest renewable energy company in the world. So there are governments who are doing the right thing and moving into renewables, and we need more leaders doing that. And the same must happen in businesses, and the same must happen in terms of individuals. We have to all understand that we have to reduce our carbon footprint or reduce our consumption of fossil fuels in nations and in businesses. And we can't now uh, delay this any longer, because with every passing day that we delay moving into renewables, we are really causing the climate emergency to get worse and worse. And Dishna, I'm sure you'll remember in one of our episodes, we said that the world needs about $6.9 trillion per annum to keep temperatures under 2 degrees centigrade. And this is to fund the infrastructure developments and the move to renewables needed. $6.9 trillion on a budget, on a global budget of $105 trillion is basically a drop in the ocean when you think about it. And the funding of this can be done by removing fossil fuel subsidies, which are now reaching $7 trillion per annum. So the carbon emission reduction program must be funded by nations first understanding that they cannot subsidize fossil fuels anymore. And that $7 trillion, if that is injected into moving into renewables, this world can easily achieve this in the next 5 to 7 years to become almost 80% renewable energy driven from its current 30%. So this is the solution to the problem. And I think the beginning of this solution can happen only if we have national leaders and business leaders and every individual understanding the urgent need to reduce carbon emissions.
Thank you, Doctor. That's quite an encouraging perspective. There is capital, there is technology. It's just a matter of deploying it to the right path.
Absolutely right. Absolutely.
And and that also gives us um, more thoughts, more ideas to think about. Innovation and sustainability is works cohesively. It's a part of the entire um, structure. It cannot work individually, and it needs to go hand in hand with both parties understanding, creating the right mindset, believe in it. I also strongly believe huge economic value can be unlocked through sustainability as an
Absolutely.
encouragement for the leaderships, individuals. Think about it in that angle, because rather than we need to do these things, we need to report these things, it might not be encouraging or motivated, but there's a huge economic value to unlock. So with that note, Doctor, thank you very much for your time. Looking forward for the next episode, which we're going to talk about health and social emergencies, what it can impact if you don't take necessary actions.
Correct.
For now, thank you very much and goodbye.
Goodbye.